to everybody. Welcome to this panel on the 15th anniversary of Nixon's trip to China. I'm Raffaella Barito. I teach American history at the Department of Political and Social Sciences of the University of Bologna. And I'm also the coordinator of the Center for the Study of the United States, housed in the Department of Political and Social Sciences. The center aims at developing a conversation among scholars of different disciplines on the history, domestic politics, and international history of the United States. I'm very happy John Harper accepted to co-organize this panel. In our view, the occasion of this anniversary could be an excellent opportunity to focus on one of the turning points in the history of the American foreign relations, but also of the international sphere as such. At the same time, it seemed to us that historical reflection on what happened 50 years ago could also be crucial in analyzing the contemporary dynamics, how to conceptualize the relationships between the United States and China, how interdependent as well as asymmetrical these connections might be considered within an international order so fragmented and so conflicting, and so on and so forth. I don't want to take time. We have 5 distinguished scholars. I'm really eager to listen to them. I just want to notice that Mario Del Pero and Sergei Radchenko will be connected online. I briefly introduce them if they are all outstanding scholars. And so I think there is no need for an introduction. However, John Harper will be our first speaker. Of course, you all know him very well. However, John is a senior adjunct professor of American foreign policy and professor emeritus at the Johns Hopkins University, and he will focus specifically on Nixon policies, if I well understood. Then we have Mario Del Pero, former professor of the University of Bologna, is currently professor of international history at Sciences Po in Paris. Mario has written extensively on many aspects of American foreign policy and American history. In particular, he published some years ago a book on one of the key figures of Nixon administration, Henry Kissinger. The title of the book is The Eccentric Realist, Henry Kissinger and the Shaping of the American Foreign Policy. Then next to me, Antonio Fiori, my colleague of Asian History and Politics at the Department of Political and Social Sciences, is one of the most esteemed experts of Korean and Chinese history. His book on the history of Asia will be published, I think, in the next few weeks. It's true.
Few months.
And Antonio will focus on the Chinese perspective. Then Sergei Radchenko, as most of you here in SAIS well know, is Wilson Schmidt, a distinguished professor of Russian history and an expert of Russian and Chinese foreign and security policies. And so he will introduce a perspective focused on the Soviet Union position and how the opening of the relationship between the United States and China affected Soviet politics and strategy. Last but not least, Matteo Diana, who is assistant professor at the Department of Political and Social Sciences of the University of Bologna. His research focuses on international relations theory, security in East Asia, Japanese and Chinese foreign policy and US foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific region. Last year, he published a book in Italian on China, the United States, and the future of international order. So he will give us, I think, a perspective on contemporary issues. I kindly ask our speakers to limit their interventions to 10 to 12 minutes in order to have time for questions and comments from the audience. And I especially encourage webinar audience to write their questions and comments in the chat. Finally, let me thank Alessandra, no?
Alessandra ci sta dicendo qualcosa. No, in the Q&A, correct?
Sorry. And thank you, Alexandra, for the invaluable help in organizing this panel. Thank you. And so, John Harper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rafaela. And thank you for organizing this. It's Rafaela who took the initiative to bring together people from both institutions. And also Alessandra, thank you for your usual impeccable attention to detail. Thank you. My focus will be on Nixon himself, why he went to China, what he accomplished during the trip. First, let's remind ourselves of the situation in 1969 when Nixon came to power. Relations between China and the United States had been frozen since the end of the Korean War. Relations were bitterly hostile ever since the US and China had fought each other to a standstill in Korea in 1953. Unlike France and the UK, the United States had never recognized Peking, as it was called. The United States recognized, of course, the Chiang Kai-shek regime on Formosa or Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, the Republic of China. There was a treaty of alliance, a formal treaty of alliance by which the United States was called upon to protect the Republic of China against the People's Republic. By the way, that term was not used in official discourse. The United States refused to use the term PRC, referring to China as either Red China or mainland China. So why did Nixon go to China and why did he go when he did? And I think here, this is a case where the conventional wisdom is basically correct. Nixon was the right man at the right time. That doesn't mean that somebody else would not have gone or could not have gone, but Nixon was well positioned to do it for at least three reasons. First of all, think about Nixon's background as a politician. Nixon, from the word go, from 1946, when he ran for Congress, had been a hardline anti-communist. He had been a member of the so-called China lobby, devoted to protecting the Chiang Kai-shek regime on Formosa. He had been a supporter, even if not a close friend, of Senator Joseph McCarthy, the notorious anti-communist witch hunter. So the point is, Nixon was in a position to be flexible and pragmatic on China because you could hardly accuse him of being soft on communism, of ever having been soft on communism. And this is what Mao himself meant during their one conversation in Beijing when he said to Nixon, "I voted for you. I like rightists. I prefer rightists to leftists." And by that, he meant people who were anti-Soviet, but also people who were politically in a position to be flexible in their domestic context. The second reason Nixon was well positioned was that, to a degree unusual for a US president, he had developed a view of the world, call it a realist view of the world, which minimized the importance of ideology and of a state's domestic political system. He knew perfectly well that Mao was a bloody and capricious killer. He knew perfectly well Mao's record as the leader of China, but what was to be gained by criticizing the Chinese domestic system? He said to Mao, quote, "What is important is not a nation's internal political philosophy. What is important is its policy toward the rest of the world and towards us," unquote. Third, and unlike Donald Trump, who is sometimes compared to Nixon, Nixon had a wealth of experience in foreign affairs, which he had acquired as vice president. He knew leaders like Adenauer and de Gaulle personally, who had encouraged him in the 60s to change American policy towards China. He had given considerable thought to the question. In a 1967 Foreign Affairs article written after a trip to Asia, he said, quote, "The world cannot be safe until China changes and until the isolation of China is overcome." What did he mean by that? Did he mean until China evolves towards greater political pluralism and democracy? No. His comparison was not with Japan or South Korea, it was with the Soviet Union, a country which had adopted a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West and whose foreign policy had mellowed in the 1960s. The time was right in the early 70s for two reasons. The first, and I'm sure my colleagues will have more to say about this, China and the Soviet Union had come to see each other as deadly enemies. A number of people in the West, not just Nixon, thought that the time was right to revive an idea which had, don't forget, had been much discussed in Washington in the late 1940s, the idea of China as an Asian Yugoslavia, as a communist counterweight to the USSR, an idea which had been much discussed and then abandoned. The second reason the time was right, of course, was the United States itself. Think about the situation of the United States itself, bogged down in a bloody stalemate in Vietnam, torn apart domestically, needing a relaxation of pressure on the periphery. Nixon's overriding priority as president, let's not forget, was to get the United States out of Vietnam with a minimum of face. So what more specifically did Nixon aim to accomplish in China? I think the most important thing was to create a new atmosphere in which to negotiate what had been the intractable issues between the two sides, the intractable conflicts, and to start a process of normalization. And in this sense, the trip was certainly a success. It was certainly a success thanks partly to the carefully choreographed photo opportunities and displays of cordiality. I brought a few pictures here. Here's one. This is the one meeting of Mao and Nixon, unscheduled right at the beginning of the visit. Nixon and the charming suave, dining with the charming suave Zhou Enlai, who was his main interlocutor during the visit, the premier of China. Nixon and his wife on touring the country on the Great Wall. This photo is interesting, by the way, because it's one of the few which shows the Secretary of State, who was Nixon systematically shunned during the visit, William Rogers. A second aim, it was partly about atmospherics, partly about setting in motion a process of normalization. A second aim was to send a message to Moscow. And I'm sure that Sergei Radchenko will have more to say about this, that Soviet fear of a US-Chinese alliance would make the Russians more flexible in dealing with the United States. I'll leave it to Sergei to tell us how successful Nixon was in that respect, but certainly to a degree. A third aim was to play on Chinese fears of the USSR, to try to gain leverage over China, to coax China into a kind of quasi-alliance. Although military and intelligence cooperation did later develop between the two sides, the Chinese were wary of becoming dependent on the United States, and they probably feared the Russians less in 1972 than they had several years before. On Vietnam, it was clear even before the trip that the Chinese had little to offer, that they had no intention of helping the United States. And their message to the United States was basically, you get out of Vietnam and we'll move on from there. I think even if they had wanted to help the United States, they had very little leverage over Hanoi. On Taiwan, which was the most important issue for the Chinese, they were also very tough, insisting that the United States break with Chiang and withdraw its forces from Taiwan. And here, of course, you had a compromise contained in the Shanghai Communique. The United States recognized the principle of one China, including Taiwan, but the Chinese had to accept that the United States would withdraw from Taiwan only gradually. And ultimately, of course, the United States retained a connection with Taiwan, which has antagonized the Chinese ever since. So the outcome of the visit was mixed, but overall, I think it's fair to say it was certainly positive in terms of Nixon's basic aims. It did begin a process of normalization, even if the process turned out to be far longer than had been expected, far slower. Even if China was of no help in getting the United States out of Vietnam with a minimum of face, having China as a de facto partner rather than an enemy lessened the impact on the United States of losing the war in Vietnam. And it helped to change the international power balance in favor of the US for the remainder of the Cold War. So to conclude, a couple of quick questions. Should we see Nixon as the originator of the policy, the later policy that assumed China would evolve in the direction of liberal democracy and capitalism, that China would become a pillar of the international system created by the United States and its allies? As suggested before, I think the answer is no. That was not Nixon's expectation. That was not Nixon's aim. Before leaving for China, Nixon had a long conversation with the French writer André Malraux, who knew China very well, who said to him, quote, think of the 16th century explorers who set out for a specific objective, but often arrived at an entirely different discovery. What you are doing, Mr. President, what you are going to do might well have a totally different outcome from whatever is anticipated. And this conversation left Nixon with a sense of foreboding about the future. Something he saw in China reinforced this sense of foreboding. And it was one of those spectacular gymnastic displays that the Chinese put on. And after that, after seeing that, he wrote in his diary, quote, not only we, but all the people of the world will have to make our very best effort if we are to match the enormous ability, drive, and discipline of the Chinese people, unquote. And in his memoirs, he says he agreed with Kissinger's view at the time that although China was clearly the weaker of the two compared to the Soviet Union, that it was the greater threat in the long run, and that sooner or later the United States would have to lean toward the Soviet Union or Russia in order to counterbalance Russia. My last question, we can come back to this, of course, what would Nixon's China policy be today? And I think the answer is probably exactly that, lean towards Russia, even at the cost of compromise on a question like Ukraine. Spheres of influence are a fact of life. What is Ukraine compared to the United States, compared to what is it to us compared to what it is for Russia? And I think he would probably see a policy that drove China and Russia into each other's arms as the height of geopolitical incompetence. Another thing he might say is that, of course, this is pure speculation. Another thing, however, I think he might say is that under no circumstances should we fight a war or a series of wars to keep Taiwan out of the hands of China. We have basically conceded that Taiwan will return to China. Taiwan is part of China sooner or later. A war or a series of wars would probably destroy our position in the Far East, not to mention Taiwan itself. So I will stop there.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for your insights about Nixon's views. I was wondering if there was also a sense of what will happen in the next few weeks with the Watergate, and so to use the Chinese opening in terms of political domestic legitimacy, but I don't know if there is this kind of connection. So I think that Mario Del Pero is already online and connected. Mario, are you online? Are you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you. I already introduced you, so if you want to, it's your turn, and so
okay.
Please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation. Apologies for joining you late. I was on a late train, and I'm in the new beautiful campus of Sciences Po where I work, and like in all new beautiful academic buildings, nothing works. So there is no the internet connection is down at the moment. So I'm on my cell phone, and I really hope it will work, and I'll be able to come through. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with you. It's also a great pleasure to see some old friends. Although online, whom I have not seen for a very long time. So I'll follow up a bit on what John was just saying. My task is to focus on Kissinger, and I'll begin with a couple of preliminary remarks and consideration. The first, I assume I missed the first part of John's intervention. I assume that he touched upon it. The first one is that the opening to China was really Nixon's idea. It was the product, if you will, of Nixon's vision much more than Kissinger's. It was Nixon who, from day one in the White House, or even before being elected, seized the initiative. Kissinger, we know, we have abundant documentation on it, was initially very skeptical and not also particularly interested. he considered the opening unrealistic given the circumstances. When asked by Nixon to assess the possibility of a rapprochement with China, he told Haig that Nixon had, quote, taken leave of reality, end quote. When Haldeman informed him, and we are already in the summer of 1969, that Nixon hoped to be able one day to visit China, possibly before the end of his second term, he replied, quote, fat chance, end quote. So why was it so? Why was Kissinger so skeptical about it? As I said, he didn't consider it realistic, feasible. China was in the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution and the post-cultural revolution. He didn't see that as an option, but possibly, and it's more interesting for us, it had a lot to do, I believe, with Kissinger's very Eurocentric, kind of, obsessively bipolar focus, and also with what was his knowledge, expertise, and again, interest, which focused on Russia, on Europe, on nuclear weapons, on arms control and arms negotiations. Preparing for the trip to China, Nixon told Kissinger, and I'm citing again, I'm a little more Chinese than many Americans, end quote, referring to, growing up in California and him being a Californian and therefore more oriented towards Asia. In the case of Kissinger, Kissinger played his German European roots all the time. He could claim that he was a little or a lot more European than many Americans, if not most Americans. So we can discuss whether the opening to China was such a stroke of boldness and strategic genius. I'm not so sure about it. In fact, it had been considered already under Johnson. I'm not saying it was a given, but it was clearly an option on the table to be pursued. And we can discuss whether political constraints or lack of thereof gave more latitude to a Republican administration, to a Republican president, which was certainly the case. That said, John was mentioning it, on the short term, the opening did not really deliver on its promises. It did offer, of course, an important leverage in the parallel negotiations going on with the Soviets, and even more, which is very important, it is emphasized in Thomas Schwartz's recent biography of Kissinger. It did pay very important political and electoral dividends for Nixon. The opening was very popular among the US public, which is something worth reflecting on and discussing, I believe. But that said, the immediate fallout was not what was expected. It took more than 6 years to fully normalize relations, also because of the vagaries of Chinese politics and the post-Mao struggle. If we agree that Kissinger was not the driving force behind the opening, and that the results were at first quite meager, it's all the more baffling that Kissinger's name became so associated with the opening, and that between the former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State and China, a sort of special and intimate relationship developed over time, with Kissinger becoming, if not a China enthusiast, certainly someone often careful to stress and recognize Beijing's political and strategic needs, to offer a sympathetic view of China, in other words, to celebrate the many positive outcomes of the Sino-American interdependence, and also to constantly praise the erudition, quote, strategic acumen, end quote, and sophistication of Chinese leaders and of his Chinese interlocutors. Beginning, of course, with Zhou Enlai, whom he admired immensely and he was very fond of. The minutes of his first meetings with Zhou and Mao during the secret and preparatory visit of July 1971 are remarkable and certainly revealing, and they cannot be attributed only to Kissinger's notorious penchant for flattery. As remarkable were his reports back to Nixon. The discussions with Kissinger informed the president, quote, had the flavor, texture, variety, and delicacy of a Chinese banquet. The talks, he continued, were, quote, the most searching, sweeping, and significant discussions I have ever had in government. The visit was, quote, a very moving experience that left an indelible impression on me, Kissinger wrote. And indelible it certainly was. In the following 4 decades, Kissinger visited China more than 50 times and became, I understand, a sort of star in China. So how do we explain it? And what do we make of this sort of unique connection and, in a way, attachment, almost emotional attachment between Kissinger and China? And I have 3 very quick answers to be eventually developed and discussed during the Q&A. The first is linked to the opening itself, which wasn't Kissinger's making or designing, as I said, but that Kissinger came somehow to symbolize, incarnate. Kissinger was not the one behind the opening, but somehow became its symbol and one of the main beneficiaries of the opening. And over time, very quickly, it became also the most ardent supporter and believer in the opening. Kissinger's media celebrity, and we know how eager he was to be in the spotlight. Kissinger's media celebrity was boosted by the secret mission of July 1971. The Unscrutable Occidental was the title of a very flattering profile published by the New York Times following the mission. The Modern Marco Polo, according to other articles, and Marco Polo or Polo One was one of the code names of the mission. The second explanation, I think, is linked to Kissinger's penchant for authoritarian leaders, and one could say governments. From Aldo Moro to Mario Soares, from Willy Brandt to James Callaghan, Kissinger seemed to have more problems with and to be less well-disposed towards democratic figures. From this perspective, Mao, Xu, Deng, and in more recent time, Hu Jintao were just some members of a very long list of authoritarian leaders with whom Kissinger had excellent relations and whom he invariably admired. The third explanation is possibly the most interesting, I believe, is that somehow China seemed to validate Kissinger's geopolitical and cultural, very essentialist proclivities and preconceptions. From his first meeting with Xu and Mao until one could say today, Kissinger has constantly downplayed the importance of the communist rupture and experience in China, the many turning points and discontinuities, preferring instead to stress the continuities and the pervasive and allegedly persistent influence of China's Confucian tradition. That tradition, and I'm citing his 2011 book on China, that tradition being, he claimed, quote, something akin to China's Bible and its constitution combined, end quote. This essentialism, one could possibly argue this Orientalism, is clearly visible, therefore, in his constant juxtaposition between this Chinese Confucian essence and the US Western essence, or particularly the US. Let me read again from On China. Quote, the Chinese ideal stress subtlety, indirection, and the patient accumulation of relative advantage, while the Western tradition prized the decisive clash of forces, end quote. When accompanying Nixon in February 1972, Kissinger even compared members of the US delegation, particularly the advanced men accompanying him and preparing the visit, to, quote, the barbarians, the learned and sophisticated Chinese had long had to put up with. So, and I leave it here, there are different explanations for this kind of special, as I said, attachment of Kissinger to China. And I believe the opening was an opening he did not initially believe very much in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. And it's a very interesting analysis of also the psychological aspects of this Kissinger moving from skepticism to a sort of fascination by authoritarian regime. And now, speaking about authoritarian regime, we have the Antonio Fiori, who will give us the Chinese perspective on this opening.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot to Johns Hopkins, first of all, for the invitation. Thank you very much, Raffaella, for having me today. What can we say about Nixon in China from the Chinese perspective? That is pretty much important. And actually, I can assure you there's no literature at all on the Chinese perspective, at least in English. And I think it's a really, really important topic because actually, in my opinion, at least in my opinion, I think that, this moment was exceptionally important because it transformed Chinese foreign policy from a point of view. And, of course, as John has already remarked, actually, possibly the US vision of China completely changed, from the red menace to, kind of tacit ally of the United States. But, actually, I think that the most important point here is to understand, what were the reasons behind the rapprochement from Beijing's point of view, more than the visit itself. And I think that actually we can talk about both strategic and ideological reasons. And from my perspective, actually, strategic reasons are much more important than ideological ones. Why? First of all, August 1968. This is actually, at least in my opinion, the most important point to take into account. The Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia, nominally to halt liberal reforms and, a divergence in Moscow's communism. And this is, considered as the catalyst for Chinese motives to seek rapprochement with the Americans. And I think it is, this is a really, really important point to raise. And we need to understand it from the Chinese point of view. Mao, at a certain point, looks at Moscow and actually recognizes that, another communist state is being invited by Moscow in order to safeguard what it considered as socialism. And these, of course, had raised fears in Beijing of, something similar happening to them. This fear was not unfounded, indeed. Moscow had criticized Beijing. You all know that basically there had been no contacts between the two countries since 1950, more or less, even though, of course, actually, we need to approach these in a specific way. I mean, there were contacts, of course, but actually, Mao didn't like Khrushchev, and actually was pretty much reciprocated in a sense. So actually, we get to the point where actually there were no relations between 1959 and 1960. And actually, Beijing had raised criticism of Moscow, characterizing basically Czechoslovakia aggression as an armed aggression in military occupation by the Soviet revisionist renegade clique. These were the words that they used. The Brezhnev doctrine made a mockery of the sovereignty of the Warsaw states, or Warsaw Pact states, and to a greater extent, all communist states. These, of course, included China. And, you know, Mao started to label Moscow as a socialist imperialist state. The strategic implication of this doctrine was clear. Moscow sought to make its will absolute and final on other states. But Mao could not agree, because actually at that point, China had already experienced the so-called century of humiliation because of the arrival of the Westerners. And actually, it is absolutely understandable that Mao was not intending to surrender Beijing's sovereignty to Moscow. If we combine the troop and war material buildup on the Soviet-Chinese border region since 1966, the Czechoslovak incident, the border clashes near Soviet railheads and Jambo Island, there is absolutely little surprise that these led to a large feeling of distrust, fear, and uncertainty. There's a security dilemma that actually Mao faced, and he feared a Soviet incursion and, of course, interpreted Soviet action as offensive in nature. So we have the rapprochement. The rapprochement with the USA actually, to a satisfactory level, could ease Chinese concerns in its coastal region. And by the way, in addition, actually, this kind of rapprochement was pretty much convenient in a sense for China from the economic point of view. Then we have the second point, in which I don't really believe in, but actually there are books which have been written on these. That is, you know, the rapprochement is basically due to the fact that after 1968, Mao's status as a revolutionary was fading, and he needed to legitimize his control through continuous ideological battles with the Soviet Union. And, you know, this was done even at the cost of employing the help of another barbarian, as Professor Del Pero has highlighted. So Mao's ideological reasoning paved the way for rapprochement with the United States. I really think that strategic reasons are more convincing than ideological ones. By the way, Mao, as you all know, was no stranger to strategic necessities that would override ideological imperatives. What do I mean? Khrushchev actually was harshly criticized by Mao because, you know, in his opinion, what Khrushchev was doing was seeking peaceful coexistence with the United States on ideological grounds. And then what Mao does is exactly the same in late 60s and early 70s. How can we account for this ideological double standard? I do believe that Mao saw the value and you know, expediency in somewhat securing China's relations with the United States to concentrate on the larger threat from the Soviets. The USA, as I said, would also prove to be a valuable economic opportunity for China. And on top of that, one of the points that we need to raise is linked to the Chinese nuclear program that was a necessity, a strategic necessity, after a consistent lack of Soviet commitment to Chinese security. I don't know how much time I have. Few minutes. So I can stop here, actually. You know, I had prepared something on the visit from the Chinese perspective, but, you know, much has been already told by John and Mario. let me just, actually, Mario was citing something which was very important, and I do absolutely and totally agree with him. It was Nixon's idea to try to find a way to reapproach China. And what I would like to say is that at the very end, in 1975, actually, Mao was about to die. He died on September 1976, the 26th, actually. What is important to say here is that, after the Watergate, and I can assure you, Mao couldn't get, actually, he had no clue about the Watergate. He couldn't understand what was happening in the United States, and he couldn't really understand why Nixon could not run for a second term. Actually, he was already in second term. Actually, because what was the consequences on Nixon of the Watergate. And what is important is that he was left actually with Henry Kissinger, and since I am pretty much interested in North Korea, as Raffaella said, I found a document that basically tells us about last visit of Kim Il-sung to Mao in China in 1975. And, in a conversation the two have, actually, Mao says something like, Kissinger is a bad man. And, Kim Il-sung says, yes, I do agree, he is wily. And, this is in the records of the Wilson Center. And, actually, I think that probably this was the outcome that eventually was to be expected since the very beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonio. Sorry for I have to perform this.
No problem.
Critical role. And then we have, I hope is online, Sergei Radchenko. Are you online?
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me.
And I already introduced it, even if you are very known in this context. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I apologize for not being there in person. I urgently had to leave Bologna yesterday for 3 days. What to say here? I am to cover the Russian angle or the Soviet angle of Nixon's 1972 visit. Let me start far away, almost as far away as Professor Harper in the early 1950s. The Sino-Soviet alliance was concluded in February 1950. That was supposed to be an eternal and unbreakable alliance. It was underpinned by communist ideology, a real menace to the West, as it was seen in the West anyway. Much of Eurasia looked red and scary, the color of blood. Turned out, the Sino-Soviet alliance was actually extremely fragile. It fell apart with only 10 years, or it started to fall apart. Officially, it remained, by the way, in place until 1979, because the treaty was signed for 30 years. But in reality, China and the Soviet Union were, of course, no longer friends from approximately, I would say, 1959. Going into the 1960s, their relationship deteriorated even further, and much has been said about this already. I would just like to highlight the Cultural Revolution in China, which began in earnest in 1966. It really had an anti-Soviet underpinning. And this is how the Soviets, how Moscow saw that. They thought that it was basically an effort to break further from the Soviet road, to break away from the Soviet experience. Soviet diplomats in Beijing came under attack from the mobs of Red Guards, and it was only through Zhou Enlai's last-minute intervention that the embassy was not broken into and diplomats were not lynched. This was certainly in the making. Then we had 1969, a really turning point in this relationship, when in March of that year, Chinese forces ambushed Soviet border guards in the area of Zhenbaodao, an island on the Ussuri River in the Far East. Soviets retaliated with great force, and basically the two sides fought an undeclared border war. Now, further border clashes occurred in August 1969, and things became so tense that the Soviet Union floated hints about a preemptive nuclear strike against China. We don't know for sure whether they were actually considering this or it was part of some kind of what is now today called an information war emanating from Moscow. We just don't have enough evidence. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear the Soviets were very apprehensive about China. Now, those signals were picked up by the United States in the context of the story that's already being told here with Nixon and Kissinger reaching out to China in order to play that card against the Soviet Union. Although I would say, as I'm sure colleagues would agree, that for Nixon at least, China was much more than a card. And in fact, he would repeatedly point out later on in his career that China was important to the United States for bigger reasons than the Soviet Union alone, that it was important on its own terms. Nevertheless, there was an aspect of this card-playing mentality as Nixon reached out to China in the aftermath of border clashes in 1960, starting really from 1969 and going, of course, with the highlight being his February 1972 trip to Beijing. What did the Soviets think about it? They suspected this was coming. They suspected already from mid-1960s that something was in the making, when even nothing was in the making at the time. But for the Soviets, you know, when the Chinese communist leaders spoke about how the Soviets were betraying capitalism, that they had those divergences in ideological terms and so on and so forth, the Soviets never took that seriously. They thought that this ideological onslaught by the Chinese communists against the Soviet Communist Party was just a made-up pretext. In reality, the Chinese were driven by great power, chauvinistic considerations. What divided them was not ideology, it was a struggle for power, they thought. This is the Soviet perspective. So in that context, they were suspecting that secretly the Chinese were already reaching out to the West and established in some kind of context. So we know that actually this was not necessarily the case, but certainly from 1969 onwards, you can say that this was the case, and Soviets, of course, learned of that. And this was a shock to the system when Nixon's visit was announced to the world. Now, why was such a shock? Well, because Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev felt that he was being preempted, and he thought this was a very threatening move by China. He was interested in improving relations with the West. I wouldn't say that he was not interested. Of course, he was interested. He was already doing it. He had already built up a fairly decent relationship with Charles de Gaulle, who had visited Moscow. He was reaching out after September 1969, when Social Democrats came to power in West Germany. Brezhnev was capitalizing on Brandt's Ostpolitik, and the relationship between West Germany and the Soviet Union began to close. But the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States was still pretty bad. And the main reason for that was the war in Vietnam. The Soviets felt like they could not betray their ally in any way it looked, if they were trying to improve relations with the United States just at the time when the Americans were bombing the hell out of North Vietnam. That would look bad for the Soviet Union. So they first wanted the United States to get out of Vietnam or to move towards peace settlement, and they were not so keen to engage on the political front until that moment when the visit by Richard Nixon was announced. Then Brezhnev realized, oh my God, if he believed in God, we have to do something, because we are being preempted and we are being outmaneuvered by the Chinese. So there we have immediately Ambassador Dobrynin reaches out to the Americans saying, can we have Nixon in Moscow, please? And then we have a move towards the famous May 1972 Moscow summit, which of course came after Nixon's visit to Beijing. And also, it almost did not happen because in the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese launched their famous Easter Offensive, to which then the Americans retaliated with serious bombardment of North Vietnam and mining of Haiphong Harbor. That really put Brezhnev before a choice. Do we have Nixon in Moscow now when the Americans are bombing North Vietnam? Well, doesn't that make us look really bad? And actually many other Soviet leaders in the Politburo were saying, no, we cannot allow this to happen. We have to cancel the summit. But Brezhnev realized, as Kissinger put it at the time, when Kissinger came to Moscow shortly before Nixon came for kind of pre-summit negotiations, and as Kissinger then reported to Nixon, Brezhnev had so much riding on the summit in terms of his personal legitimacy as a leader. So even though the Americans were bombing North Vietnam, because of what happened in China with the summit between Nixon and Mao, Brezhnev now had to have Nixon in Moscow. So the summit took place. There was an interesting anecdote prior to the summit. So when Kissinger was in Moscow, Brezhnev complained to him about something. He said, you know, when President Nixon was in China, there was a banquet. And in this banquet, he made a toast. And in this toast, he said that China and the United States were holding the fate or the destiny of the world in their hands. And Brezhnev said, you know, how could he have said this? This is so awful. Of course, his meaning was, it wasn't China that was holding the destiny of the world. It was the Soviet Union and the United States that were holding the destiny of the world in their hands. And Kissinger tried to explain it. He said, oh, you know, President Nixon had too much to drink. He didn't really mean it, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, this was major complaint on the part of Brezhnev, because what he wanted was he wanted to develop a relationship with the United States that would be something like a condominium. The Soviet Union as a great power agrees to work with the United States, another superpower, to manage the world. And that included managing China, because the Chinese were crazy as far as the Soviets were concerned, managing the Middle East, because, you know, there was a mess in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Arabs. So this was Brezhnev's approach. It was very much in that mentality of co-managing the world together with the United States. And this is what he wanted to do with Nixon when Nixon came to Moscow in May 1972. So basically, this was the purpose of the summit. There was one interesting element when, you know, the summit was the Moscow summit was very cordial. There was such a great reception for Nixon, except for one moment during the summit. There was a meeting. Everything was so friendly, and then suddenly, in the middle of the meeting, Brezhnev starts lashing out against Nixon, saying that the United States is such a bloodthirsty country. They are destroying Vietnam. How could they do this kind of thing? This is absolutely awful. And he just goes on and on and on. And Nixon, in his memoirs, writes about it. That I could not understand what was going on. He was just patting me on the back. We had such a friendly conversation. Suddenly, just launches, you know, with this monologue. Now we know, with the help of the Russian archival documents, we can see what happened there. So Brezhnev was speaking for the transcript, because later on he showed this transcript to the Vietnamese, to the Cubans, and say, oh, you know what? We really, in holding the summit, we did not sell out to American imperialism because we still criticize them for their crimes in Vietnam. And this was, you know, part of his kind of alibi, I guess, with the revolutionary world. But fundamentally, he really valued this personal relationship with Nixon, and he just wanted to make sure that Nixon would value and understand that as well, and not go over to China, which was obviously, you know, an enemy to be mistrusted. So this was the Soviet reaction to this. A short anecdote: in 1973, and I'll finish with that. In 1973, Brezhnev went to the United States on kind of with a reciprocal visit, met with Nixon in the White House, where Nixon had installed a secret taping system, where hence we have the only recording of Brezhnev's conversation with Nixon, actual voices, you can actually hear them on the tape, which is very interesting. Brezhnev he was really flattering Nixon, and he was just trying to, schmooze, and it was a very interesting encounter. And then they flew to California, and in California, they had a number of meetings, of which only Russian transcripts survive. Nixon did not keep his record of some of those meetings. And in one of those meetings, over dinner, Nixon made a toast. It was not a public toast like in Shanghai, or like in Beijing back in, or was it in Shanghai? Where did he make this toast? But anyway, it was not like in China, but it was a private conversation with Brezhnev during the dinner. And as Nixon was drinking, he made a toast. He said, the destiny of the world is in the hands of the Soviet Union and the United States. And this toast was written down on the Soviet transcript and received a stamp top secret and circulated to the top leaders in Moscow, to the Politburo. But, just to emphasize that, it doesn't matter what Nixon was saying to the Chinese in public. In reality, he thinks that we are the key partner for the United States and not the Chinese. And I'll end on this note.
Thank you, Sergey, very much. I found interesting this idea of the co-managing the world, and I wonder if even now there is this attempt of co-managing the world. But I leave the floor to Matteo Dian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raffaella, and thank you, John, for inviting me to this roundtable. It's really a pleasure to be part of this. For my remark, we fast forward 50 years indeed, and we introduce the current state of US-China relationship. At the moment, we live in what Orville Schell has defined the death of the engagement. So that policy that shaped the American approach towards China in the period after the visit of Nixon to Beijing is now officially over. We know what happened, of course, during the Trump administration with the deterioration of bilateral relations, the trade war, the American criticism for the COVID pandemic, but also the Chinese assertiveness in South China Sea, Hong Kong, the threats against Taiwan, and so on and so forth. And of course, the list of things going sideways between the two great powers is very long. We can quote certain moments in this process of the end of engagement. For instance, the speeches by Vice President Pompeo, Vice President Pence, Pompeo as Secretary of State. And I think that last one, the speech that the Secretary of State gave in 2020 at the Nixon Library, is particularly significant. Exactly because it was at the Nixon Library, a particularly important place. And he went to remark that the policy of engagement had failed and had to be substituted by something else that you can call great power competition, or in a more contemporary definition, strategic competition. And he criticized that approach, stating that rather than changing China, he had transformed China into a monster, strong economically, but remained authoritarian and Marxist ideologically and politically. So from that point onwards, there's been a strong criticism also historically of past approaches to the strategy of engagement. From that point of view, however, is hard to understand what previous administrations could do differently, especially because the strategy of engagement fit the rest of the grand strategy of the United States, particularly after the Cold War. If during the Cold War, the engagement of China had a strategic purpose that was the one of balancing the USSR, increasingly, and especially during the 90s, the idea was that Chinese were changing. It was a liberal approach. The idea was capitalism, membership in international institutions, trade would transform the PRC. Of course, that didn't take too much into account the fact that the Chinese kept on repeating that they didn't like liberal democracy and they were not changing, and they were to adhere to the four cardinal principles. So probably on the American side, it was a bit naive, but still in the 90s, the hope for change for the entire world and the grand strategy of enlargement and engagement of the Clinton administration, for instance, was a sign that things were going in that direction, and they could go in that direction. If the Soviet Union had fell, also China could change from within. So many of the policies that the United States implemented in the 90s and the 2000s were meant to avoid China returning to what it was, rather than preventing China becoming a great power that it is today. If we look back to the trip of National Security Advisor Scowcroft in '89 after Tiananmen Square, the idea was exactly, let's prevent another closure. So let's keep the door open, that door that President Nixon had opened for the United States. So that was the purpose. Let's keep the ball rolling, so to speak. Let's help China to change and become more similar to us. In hindsight, probably expectations were too high, and China did not change in that way. But also we are looking at the depth of engagement under particular Chinese leadership, which is the leadership of Xi Jinping. That is very different from previous leaders like Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. One other thing that I would like to underline is that the depth of engagement happened during the Trump administration, and of course, the Trump administration was an outlier in many things, in most things, in the approach to grand strategy, not just towards China, but alliances, NATO, climate change, you name it. Of course, the Trump administration was, in terms of rhetoric, but also in terms of substance, very different from what we had before under Obama and, of course, under Biden today. But when it comes to China, there is one striking element. The Trump administration motivated the shift in very Trumpian terms, so to speak. Going back to those speeches, you can find the influence of authors like Peter Navarro, the famous author of the book Death by China, that sort of fitted a lot the Trump narrative of seeing China as that actor that was basically contributing to steal the jobs of the American people. So that move was particularly Trumpian. But unlike anything else, think about management of alliances, think about climate change, think about trade. The United States didn't change that much when the Biden administration came to power. Bringing to power someone much more mainstream in terms of ideas, contribution, approaches to policy. So the methods are different, the instruments are different, but what has changed during the Trump administration and has not switched back is the idea of China as a competitor. That is remarkably similar, even if the Biden and the Trump administration are so different. And that is really, I mean, something to investigate for future historians, probably. But it's important today to underline that those people that are influencing Biden's approach to China are by any means foreign policy hawks. Let's see examples. Well, they are mainstream in Washington, but the entire mainstream has shifted and shifted quite deeply and quite rapidly. Mentioning what people like Craig Campbell was writing already during the Trump administration, and then they went to have a deep influence on the Biden. Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, but also people that is very influential now in the Biden administration at a slightly lower level, but still very influential. Let's mention someone like Rush Doshi, in the National Security Council, the author of a book called The Long Game, very interesting, that talks about the strategy of displacement that China has been putting in place to displace Washington from the leadership at international level. Eli Ratner, working at the Pentagon, again, as Assistant Secretary, someone that, again, is pushing for a line that considers China as a competitor and not a state that the United States can have a cooperative relationship with. So, of course, there is a difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, but is more in means than in ends when it comes to China. And this is really remarkable. We have, of course, to underline that Biden, during the virtual summit with Xi Jinping in November 22, underlined the fact that guardrails are in place. So keeping the door open to diplomacy, keeping the door open to trade is still important, but their relationships has shifted to competition. Call it great power competition, call it strategic competition, but now it's competition. The means are different. Biden values much more the role of alliances, values much more the role of multilateralism, free trade for sure, partnership, and the new Indo-Pacific strategy published just last week underlines the role of partnership and alliances quite a bit. But still it's competition, and that shift is something that we have to understand because, again, it was not just a Trumpian move, it was the entire foreign policy community that moved in a certain direction towards more competition. And this is something really worth mentioning, especially in this context, because it really closes the long page opened with the Nixon visit in 1972. And at the moment, the competition is not just strategic, is ideological, is economic, and is between two different models of regional order. And the competition is, again, will involve gaining support and gaining consensus in Europe. And I think the Biden administration has been doing a good job on that, but also in Asia. And in Asia, it's not easy to ask partners and allies, aside from Japan probably, to completely align with the United States when it comes to security, but also when it comes to trade. It is important to underline also that we have to stress the agency of local partners, especially when it comes to Asia. It's very difficult to ask them to just take one side. While in the Cold War, it was much more natural to say you have to be either on one side or the other. Now it's something very, very complicated to do, especially in Asia. So it will be very interesting to see how this dynamic evolves, but definitely we are, again, in a different page compared to the decades after 1972. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, it's time for your questions, of course, if you would like to. I'm looking to see if there are any coming in online. There are a few. There are three actually from Anya. So far, it's only Anya who is contributing here. But let me take at random her last question. In regards to genocide in Xinjiang, China, where millions are on lockdown and millions of women are becoming sterilized by force, does the US and Russia currently stand? I guess what will happen, I'm not sure that who that is directed to. Would anyone like to comment on that? Any of our panelists?
Antonio, there was a...
Maybe Antonio.
I understand the question.
It has to do with...
It was about the lockdown and the genocide.
It has to do with the China and Xinjiang.
US position.
US
Women
position.
are becoming civilized.
Xinjiang has provoked actually many problems to the Chinese regime, both in the United States and Europe, I must say, because actually, the European point of view has been that and all states, all member states of the European Union actually have agreed on, that what is happening in Xinjiang is to be considered as a violation of human rights. And actually, what the European Union did, when was it? March 21, if I'm not wrong. But actually, the European Union decided to sanction China, and the same day, actually, few hours later, China sanctioned few individuals, few Europeans, actually, banning them from entering China again. And some societies, some European societies actually were banned as well. So, I mean, at least on this point, I think that both Europe and the US are on the same page. Now, let me tell you something, very briefly, actually. And please take my words as I am pronouncing them. There has not been any evidence of any kind of genocide in Xinjiang. And so what I'm saying is that I'm not saying there's no genocide in Xinjiang. For sure, actually, what Beijing has been doing in Xinjiang for the last decades is a kind of, depriving Xinjiang people from basically, how to say, express their roots freely. Because actually what Beijing does is basically trying to dilute the blood of Xinjiang people by eventually bringing Han Chinese to the Xinjiang region and trying to conquer the spaces which should be of Xinjiang people. But what I'm saying is that we have no evidences of any concentration camps. We don't have evidences of any kind of violence which is perpetrated against people in Xinjiang. I'm probably at a certain point, actually, we will have evidences, and this will become, how to say, more clear.
Do we have questions?
For a very interesting panel on the anniversary, almost the anniversary of the move to China. I mean, it stands as a classic move of realism in international politics, doesn't it? And realism is associated with a lot of things, sometimes the neglect of the domestic politics dimension, which we've just been talking about, but also as spheres of influence. And it was interesting that Professor Fiori referred to the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, because one of the things that was characteristic of that was that the United States and the Western Allies stood back, and China would have noted that as well as possibly part of its analysis of what might happen if the Soviet Union was to be encouraged in that. But from our general point of view, the Americans, as we see now, have never been totally comfortable with the idea of spheres of influence. I mean, they might have settled for bipolarity at the nuclear strategic level with the Soviet Union. And the particular circumstance of Europe might have required that. But certainly, as far as I understand it, in the Asia Pacific, that was not an issue. I mean, they were in Vietnam at the time. Kissinger was interested in what was going on in Pakistan and India at the same point. And China, of course, there was not a question of China at that time, as I understand it, of China even aspiring to a sphere of influence. For one thing, it didn't have anything like the nuclear and strategic importance of the Soviet Union at the time. It wasn't a threat to the United States, although occasionally, Mort Halperin wrote about the ABM treaty and so on. But the Americans were more concerned with the Soviet Union. So it gave the Americans the opportunity to make this move, as we can now see in retrospect, because there was no danger of having to concede the kind of things that they were having to concede to the Soviet Union.
No, I do have a couple of questions.
Could I,
Yeah,
point
sorry.
on the spheres of influence, just to clarify Nixon's view, I think Nixon would have said that to deny the existence of spheres of influence in geopolitics, it would be like denying the law of gravity in physics. It's a fact of life. And we've had ours, the Russians have theirs, Chinese presumably aspire to have theirs. And Nixon accepted that, I mean, as a fact. And as a premise of good relations. There's a remarkable conversation that he had with Kissinger. I don't know if Mario will remember this, in April 1972, when Kissinger was leaving for Moscow on the trip that Sergei mentioned. And he said, here's what I want you to say to Brezhnev. That you have basically, I'm oversimplifying, but this is really what it boils down to. You have your sphere and we have ours, and we're going to get along well. We're going to have good relations. If you stay out of ours, and we're going to stay out of, and we expect you to stay out of ours. I mean, he didn't literally follow that advice himself always, and he couldn't say it publicly. But I think that's where Nixon himself was coming from. And I think today, I think he would say the same thing about Russia's aspiration to influence Ukraine. They're going to do it. They have more at stake than we do. It would be foolish to challenge them. And on the basis of recognizing their special interests there, we can get along fine. And why have we so foolishly ruled out playing the Russian card in the pursuit of an illusion that somehow we are going to bring Ukraine into our sphere? I think that's what he would say now. Anyway, he's not around. But I think there are things that one can learn from him.
Fascinating panel. Of course, it does depend what you understand by the word influence. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and so far I've got 28 synonyms for the word influence, and found that the international relations specialists let me down when they come to try to understand the concept of influence. But I've got a couple of questions. Antonio, you spent a lot of time in South Korea. The South Koreans must have been horrified by what was happening with the opening of Nixon to China. Do you have any information on what they thought at the time? Do they ever comment about it now? That's a question for Antonio. Very briefly to Mario. Mario, you cited Malraux, who is often a very interesting relationship with de Gaulle, and was also a man of the world, and especially of Asia. Do you have any information on what de Gaulle thought about Nixon's opening to China? Thank you.
I think I was the one who cited Malraux, actually. Yeah. And the answer to your question is that de Gaulle encouraged Nixon to pursue it. When Nixon went to see de Gaulle in 1969, it was his first foreign trip. De Gaulle, they discussed it and he encouraged it.
We have a comment from chat. Martin Wesley.
Yeah, we have our old friend Martin.
Nixon's. Yes, but
Okay.
I think Mario would reply also to this comment.
Okay.
Nixon's vision versus Kissinger's pragmatism was highlighted. The simple question, was Nixon right? So I to John and to Mario for the
Okay,
reply.
this will go to Mario. Did you get the question, Mario? Anyway, it's our old friend Martin Westlake who's asking, was Nixon's vision versus Kissinger's pragmatism? A simple question, was Nixon right? By which I suppose I mean, how might the world have developed if Nixon had not taken such a bold initiative, even if it had been talked about already in LBJ's time? What would have happened if Nixon had not taken the initiative? It's all yours, Mario.
Okay, thanks. Quickly, I'd like to comment on several questions. The first one on realism. John was mentioning the sphere of influence. I mean, the China Open was also coherent with the broader Nixon doctrine, which was about, delegating responsibilities, reducing commitments, and reducing cost. It was perfectly coherent with a new kind of, limitationist strategy. The definition was Robert Osgood, one of Kissinger's advisors and a political scientist. The new limitationism imposed by Vietnam, but by MAD, by nuclear deterrence, by the situation within the US, somehow had to be faced by reducing global commitments and delegating responsibilities, and co-opting China was part, I believe, of that broader strategy. That said, all what I have seen in the archives, what many Kissinger scholars have seen, what's central, truly central in Tom Schwartz's book, which came out a year ago, is how heavily domestic considerations played in the overall decision. The China opening was very popular. Foreign policy, Nixon's foreign policy was a major political and electoral asset. And Kissinger and Nixon paid, as it is inevitable, close attention to the political implications of foreign policy choices. So to use a very unpleasant neologism, the intermestic was central. The interplay between the domestic and the international. If I'm not mistaken, I recognize David's voice in the public among the people who intervened. So the goal was almost out. He clearly appreciated the overall geopolitical design, the opening to China, but the goal was, at the end of his political career and even of his life. Finally, Martin's question, was Nixon right? He wasn't bold, as I said. I mean, opening to China was not such a, an eccentric and original strategy. It was in the card. He wasn't right. He wasn't bold, but he was right. At the end, it was feasible. It worked out, and it became, as I said, a major political asset, giving the U.S. leverage vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, giving Nixon the political and electoral dividend payback he was looking for. Thank you.
We have a bit more time, or do we? Yeah, we have 5 minutes anyway.
Thank you. Very,
Simone.
very quickly. David, thank you very much for the question, actually. Not only Koreans were horrified, and by the way, Koreans were not horrified. The Japanese actually were absolutely and totally taken by surprise. I mean, the Nixon shocks, were like an explosion. And the Japanese were totally, I don't even know how to actually label the reaction that Japan had. The best ally in Asia, and you do not inform us that you're going to Beijing. South Koreans were not horrified, actually, for many reasons. The most important was that already in 71, 72, actually, there was a kind of tow between the United States and South Korea, which basically, started in 1968. Different visions, and the only real common ground between South Korea and the United States was actually the Vietnam War, to which, of course, as you know, the South Korean contingent actually participated. At a certain point towards the end of the Vietnam War, actually, there were more Koreans than Americans in Vietnam. For them, actually trying to keep a good relationship with the US was exceptionally important because, of course, Vietnam, from Vietnam, actually, South Korea got money. And, what Park Chung-hee was demonstrating, was showing at that moment, was that not only he was a very good leader, but also the leader who was eventually, managing the economic reconstruction of his country. So.
Sergey? Would you like to comment on anything that's been said?
Or that's been said so far? I don't think so. I think all this have been very good questions and good answers. And one thing that I was going to add is if you trace forward, if you go a little bit forward and see how the Sino-Soviet relationship worked out, you realize that when you get to the late 1970s, early 1980s, the Soviet Union at the time was quite isolated internationally. They had invaded Afghanistan. There was a situation in Poland where the United States was applying economic sanctions as a result of a declaration of martial law. So the Soviets felt like they were under pressure from the West, in particular from the United States. At the same time, in China, Mao Zedong had obviously died in 1976. You had Deng Xiaoping, who actually was quite anti-Soviet at first, but then what he realized especially after his February 1979 visit to the United States, was that there were limits to the Sino-American relationship. He had hoped for this quasi-alliance against the Soviet Union. He really counted on American technologies, on trade, et cetera, What he saw was that the United States was not going to support his bid to reunify with Taiwan, hence the Taiwan Relations Act of March 1979. He also saw, especially under early Reagan administration, the United States was withholding sales of sensitive technologies to China and was actually contemplating selling very advanced aircraft to Taiwan. So as a result, you have a beginning of change in the Chinese thinking, which actually came to the fore with the proclamation in September 1982 of China's so-called independent foreign policy, because Deng Xiaoping realized that if the Americans could play China as a card against the Soviet Union, they did not want to be played. The Chinese did not want to be played as a card. Now, with the Soviet Union also being isolated, the Soviet leaders also realized that the Chinese were not so bad after all. So from 1982, you have the beginning of the Sino-Soviet rapprochement. In fact, it was launched in March 1982 by Brezhnev in a speech in Tashkent, and then picked up speed after Brezhnev died, and especially under Gorbachev. So much so that by May 1989, you have a visit by Mikhail Gorbachev to Beijing, and the effective normalization of the Sino-Soviet relationship. And that relationship continued to develop and grow until the present day. Today, Putin and Xi Jinping see their relationship as the best ever in history, and China and Russia are remarkably close. So that is interesting. That is interesting to trace how this relationship evolved and changed from Nixon's historic visit in February 1972 to our own very present moment, when it seems that China and Russia are on such close terms, and the United States is opposed to both.
Okay, I guess we're technically just about out of time, but we do have one more question, and it looks tailor-made for you, Matteo. It has to do with Taiwan. 50 years later, the fate of Taiwan hangs in the balance of what will happen, basically. Predict the future. What is the end game?
Well, this is very complicated to answer. It's really a dilemma, because, of course, if you see that Taiwan, contemporary Taiwan, as a democracy that respects human rights and also represents the fact that there's nothing in the way of the Chinese people, because, of course, Taiwanese people are Chinese, and they are also democratic. So that is particularly problematic from Beijing's point of view. But if we see Taiwan as a democracy, then of course it makes sense to protect it from Beijing. And this is something that the Biden administration seems to be inclined to do. But of course, the balance of interest, so to speak, is much in favor of Beijing. Namely, Beijing cares much more than Washington, cares much more than anyone else about Taiwan. My opinion is that probably we will not have a war in a conventional sense, but the influence that China will be able to impose on Taiwan will grow through time. So the decision whether to defend Taiwan or not is not just simply a matter of go to war for Taiwan, but rather step by step, whether or not try to respond to this growth of Chinese influence towards Taiwan. And it's very complicated for everyone. If you see how China reacts every time someone hints towards not necessarily recognizing Taiwan, but having even informal relations with Taiwan, then there is strong coercive reaction by the side of the Chinese. So that difference in terms of how much we care is probably crucial from that point of view.
Nixon would agree with you.
Yeah, probably.
You want to say good night to everyone?
Thank you. Thank you for this very fascinating panel. So I want just to thank all the audience and the speakers. And I hope in the next opportunity to have a discussion and this sort of cooperation between SAIS and our department. Thank you and good evening to
And
everyone.
once again, this was Rafaela's idea, so we should really thank her more than anyone. So.